Imagine a world shattered by conflict. In 1918, the First World War had left Europe devastated. Millions dead, empires fallen, and a generation lost. People everywhere demanded a new way to prevent such catastrophe from ever happening again. Out of this desperation for peace, the League of Nations was born, a bold experiment in global cooperation. Its core idea: collective security. An attack on one would be considered an attack on all. The League's headquarters were set in neutral Geneva, Switzerland, with an assembly for all members and a council for urgent crises. The hope was that nations would talk, not fight. Reason would replace force. Collective security meant all members would act together to protect any threatened nation. First, the League would apply moral pressure, publicly condemning aggressors. If that failed, economic sanctions would follow, cutting off trade to weaken the aggressor. As a last resort, military force could be used. The theory: no nation would dare attack if the world stood united against it. This was a promise of safety in numbers, especially appealing to smaller nations. The old system of secret alliances and arms races had led to war. Collective security was meant to be the antidote. The League system was open and transparent, with shared responsibility for peace. The 1920s would test this revolutionary idea. Could the League really prevent another devastating war? The world watched and waited, hoping for a new era. Never before had so many countries agreed to work together for peace. The League was a symbol of hope, a world governed by reason, not force. For the first time, nations pledged to settle disputes peacefully. The scars of war fueled a dream, that diplomacy could triumph over violence. The League's mission was clear: make war unthinkable. But would this dream survive the realities of the New World? The League of Nations emerged directly from the horrors of World War I. The old ways of international relations had failed catastrophically. A new system was desperately needed. American President Woodrow Wilson became the driving force, championing a new world order based on morality and law. In his 14 points, Wilson called for a general association of nations to guarantee political independence and territorial integrity. At the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson persuaded Allied leaders to embrace his vision. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, established the League in its very first section. Its aims: promote international cooperation, achieve peace and security, and respect international law. The League's structure included an assembly, a council, and a permanent secretariat. The world greeted the League with optimism. It represented a shift from the old balance of power politics to cooperation and shared values. The hope diplomacy and disarmament would make the world safer for all. For the first time, nations pledged not to go to war and to maintain open, honorable relations. The League was a bold step toward a new era. The stage was set for its important work. Would this new organization live up to its promise? Collective security was the League's foundation. A simple idea, but hard to put into practice. If one country was attacked, all others would respond together. The first step: moral condemnation, naming and shaming the aggressor. If that failed, economic sanctions would follow, aiming to cripple the aggressor's economy. As a last resort, the League could recommend military action, but the League had no army of its own. It relied on members to provide troops. This made any military response slow and uncertain. Major powers like Britain and France had to be willing to act, even in conflicts that didn't affect them directly. The League's strength depended on the political will of its members. Without unity and commitment, collective security was just a theory. The League's greatest weakness: it could not force nations to act against their own interests. The idea was powerful, but reality proved far more complicated. Despite its later reputation, the League achieved real successes in the 1920s. In 1921, Sweden and Finland clashed over the Åland Islands. Both turned to the League for a peaceful solution. The League ruled the islands would remain with Finland, but protected the Swedish-speaking population's rights. Both nations accepted the decision. War was averted through negotiation. In Upper Silesia, Germany and Poland disputed a valuable industrial region. The League oversaw a plebiscite, then carefully partitioned the territory, balancing economic and ethnic concerns. Neither side was fully satisfied, but both accepted the outcome. The League's mediation prevented violence and kept the peace. Beyond politics, the League tackled humanitarian crises, helping refugees, fighting diseases, and combating slavery and drug trafficking. These early victories built credibility and showed that international cooperation could work. The League's commissions studied disputes, listened to all sides, and proposed fair solutions. When nations were willing to cooperate, the League's methods succeeded. Its humanitarian work saved lives and set new standards for global action. The 1920s proved the League could make a difference. These successes were real and should not be forgotten. The League's promise was most visible when nations chose diplomacy over conflict. Yet the League's failures exposed its deep weaknesses. In 1920, Poland seized Vilna from Lithuania. The League condemned the action, but Poland refused to withdraw. Britain and France, seeing Poland as a key ally, refused to act forcefully. The League did nothing, sending a message that powerful nations could defy it. In 1923, Italy's Mussolini bombarded Corfu after an Italian general was killed in Greece. Greece appealed to the League, which condemned Italy's aggression. Mussolini ignored the League, threatening to withdraw. Britain and France hesitated, not wanting to alienate Italy. The dispute was handed to the Conference of Ambassadors, which sided with Italy. Greece was forced to apologize and pay compensation. Mussolini claimed victory. The League was humiliated and its authority undermined. These failures showed that when major powers acted aggressively, the League was powerless. Its lack of enforcement and reliance on goodwill left it exposed. The League's inability to act decisively eroded its credibility. Aggressors learned they could act with impunity. The dream of collective security was fading. The world saw the League's limits all too clearly. The League was born with high hopes and serious flaws. The United States, despite Wilson's vision, never joined. Without America, the League lacked prestige and power. Sanctions were weak. Nations could still trade with the U.S. Britain and France, weakened by war, were reluctant to act as global enforcers. The League had no army of its own, relying on members to provide troops. Decisions required unanimous council votes, making action slow and often impossible. Self-interest often trumped principle. Leading powers put their own concerns first. Defeated nations like Germany and Russia were excluded for years, making the League look like a victor's club. The structure led to paralysis in crises. The League's authority was undermined from the start. Its weaknesses would haunt it in the years ahead. Why did the League succeed in some cases? Its victories often came when disputes involved smaller nations willing to accept its authority. After World War I, countries like Sweden, Finland, Germany, and Poland wanted to avoid more conflict. The League provided a neutral forum for negotiation and compromise. When both sides were open to discussion, the League's mediation worked. Its commissions investigated thoroughly and proposed fair solutions. The League's agencies also made real progress, combating disease, improving labor conditions, and helping refugees. These humanitarian achievements changed lives worldwide. The League's successes were real when nations cooperated. Its greatest strength was as a forum for peaceful resolution. Historians disagree on the League's legacy. Realists see it as a failure, naive, powerless, and doomed from the start. They point to its inability to stop aggression by major powers and its structural weaknesses. For them, the League was a talking shop that created a false sense of security. Others, the idealists, argue the League was not a total failure. They highlight its successes in the 1920s and its humanitarian work. The problem, they say, was not the League's ideals, but the lack of political will from its members. The League was a bold experiment and a necessary first step. It laid the groundwork for the United Nations. Its legacy is both cautionary and inspiring. The League of Nations was a grand experiment born from hope, undone by reality. It showed that international cooperation could work, but only when nations were willing. Its successes in the 1920s proved diplomacy could prevent war. Its humanitarian work left a lasting mark. But its flaws, lack of U.S. support, no army, and self-interested members proved fatal. When faced with determined aggressors, the League was powerless. Its failures were rooted in deep structural and political weaknesses. The League was a noble failure, a visionary step forward, but not enough to secure lasting peace. It paved the way for the United Nations, learning from its mistakes. The dream of collective security survived, even as the League itself faded. The League's story is a lesson in both the promise and the limits of international cooperation.